Session 81 covers environment connection setup for Salesforce development, the authentication plumbing that every other part of your workflow depends on. We'll cover three contexts: Salesforce CLI for local development, the VS Code Salesforce extension pack for editor integration, and JWT bearer token authentication for CI/CD pipelines where interactive OAuth is not possible. Connection setup is the first thing that has to work. Every CLI command, every VS Code metadata operation, every automated pipeline step requires an authenticated session with a specific Salesforce org. Authentication errors at the start of a workflow block everything downstream. Getting this right once, with the right method for each context, means you never have to debug auth failures mid-deployment. The Salesforce CLI uses a web OAuth flow for interactive authentication. The command opens a browser window where you log in with your Salesforce credentials. On successful login, the CLI captures the OAuth access token and stores it locally at /sf/credentials.json. The alias you specify becomes the short name for all subsequent commands targeting that org. Once authenticated, you run commands against the org using target org followed by the alias. The critical difference between sandbox and production authentication is the instance URL. Sandbox orgs authenticate at test.salesforce.com, the sandbox login endpoint. Production orgs authenticate at login.salesforce.com, the production login endpoint. If you run sf org login web without specifying instance URL for a sandbox, the browser will open at login.salesforce.com, and you'll find yourself logging into your production org instead of the sandbox. The instance URL flag is not optional for sandbox authentication. After authenticating, SF org list shows all your connected orgs with their aliases, usernames, instance URLs, and session status. To avoid specifying target org on every command, set a default org for your project using sfconfig set target org dev1 project. The project flag writes this setting to the .sf/config.json file in your project directory, so the default applies to all CLI commands run from that directory without affecting other projects. Interactive OAuth tokens expire after 2 hours. When a token expires, the next CLI command that requires org access will prompt reauthentication. In the middle of a development session, this is an interruption. The fastest way to refresh without going through the full OAuth flow again is sf org open, target org dev1. This opens the org in a browser tab and refreshes the token as a side effect. The CLI then proceeds without reauthentication for another 2 hours. The Salesforce extension pack for VS Code integrates the CLI's org management directly into the editor. Once installed, the extension reads the CLI's authenticated org list. You don't need to authenticate separately in VS Code if you've already run sf org login web. The extension surfaces your orgs in the sidebar and lets you browse metadata, run SOQL queries, and trigger deployments from within the editor. The one configuration requirement for VS Code extension activation is an sfdxproject.json file in your project's root directory. Without this file, the Salesforce extension does not recognize the directory as a Salesforce project, and most features remain inactive. A minimal sfdxproject.json defines your package directory, typically ForceApp, and the Salesforce API version. Both are required. Without the API version, some extension features will prompt you to set it. With sfdxproject.json in place, the extension activates the full feature set: Apex language support with IntelliSense and real-time error detection, the org browser sidebar panel for retrieving metadata without command line commands, the SOQL builder for visual query construction with inline result preview, Lightning Web Component support, including live preview, and the Apex replay debugger, which lets you replay Apex execution from debug logs as if stepping through a live debugger session. The Apex replay debugger deserves special attention as it's the most powerful debugging tool available for Salesforce development without a paid IDE subscription. You capture a debug log from a failing Apex transaction, then load it into the replay debugger. The debugger lets you step through the execution line by line, inspect variable values at each step, and identify exactly where the logic diverged from expected behavior, all without modifying production code or requiring a live Apex debug session. CI/CD pipelines present a fundamental authentication problem. There is no browser. The web OAuth flow that works perfectly on a developer's machine is impossible in an automated pipeline running on a build server. Salesforce solves this with the JWT Bearer Token Flow, a non-interactive authentication mechanism that doesn't require browser interaction at any point. JWT Bearer Token authentication works as follows. The pipeline generates a JSON Web Token signed with a private RSA key. It sends this JWT to Salesforce's token endpoint. Salesforce validates the JWT's signature using the corresponding public certificate stored in a connected app. If validation succeeds, Salesforce returns an OAuth access token. The CLI can then use this access token for all subsequent API calls. The entire exchange happens programmatically, no browser, no user interaction required. The first step in setting up JWT auth is generating the RSA key pair. 3 pencil commands. Genersa generates the 2048-bit private key. The REQ command generates a certificate signing request. The X509 command creates a self-signed certificate from that request, valid for 365 days. The certificate file, server.crt, goes to Salesforce. The private key file, server.key, stays secret and goes to your CI/CD platform as an encrypted variable. Rotate the certificate before the 365-day expiry, or your pipelines will stop authenticating. In Salesforce Setup, go to App Manager and create a new connected app. Enable OAuth settings. Set the callback URL to https://login.salesforce.com/services/OAuth2/success. Required even for JWT Flow. Check. Use digital signatures and upload the server.crt certificate you generated. Select OAuth scopes. At minimum, manage user data via API, and perform requests at any time, refresh_token, offline_access. Save the app and copy the consumer key from the connected app detail page. The CI/CD service account user must be explicitly authorized to use the connected app. In the connected app settings, click Manage, then Manage Profiles or Manage Permission Sets, and add the profile or permission set assigned to your deployment user. Without this step, JWT authentication will return an invalid_client_ID error even if the consumer key and certificate are correct. Store the private key contents as a CI/CD secret. In GitHub Actions, add it as a repository secret under Settings Secrets and Variables Actions. In your pipeline YAML, write the secret value to a temporary file before the authentication step and delete it after. Never include server.key in your repository, even in a private repo, as key exposure would allow anyone who gains repository access to authenticate to your Salesforce org. The JWT authentication command in the pipeline, sf org login JWT with client ID set to the consumer key from the connected app, JWT key file pointing to the temporary key file you wrote from the secret, username set to the Salesforce username of the deployment user, instance URL set to https://login.salesforce.com for production or https://test.salesforce.com for sandbox, and alias set to whatever short name you use in subsequent deploy commands. After successful authentication, all subsequent SF commands run against this authenticated session using the alias. For teams with multiple environments, consistent alias naming is not a style choice. It's an operational requirement. When your pipeline YAML specifies target org prod, every developer's machine and every build environment needs prod to map to the production org. If one developer used production and another used prod, shared scripts break. Establish the convention early. Dev1 for developer sandboxes, QA1 for QA partial copy, UAT1 for UAT full copy, prod for production. Document it. Enforce it. For production org protection beyond the standard authentication controls, the CLI supports a no prompt flag combined with explicit confirmation settings that require a deliberate command line flag for destructive deployments. Combined with a deployment approval gate in your CI/CD pipeline, a required manual approval before production deploys run. This creates a two-layer safeguard against accidental production changes. The authentication is the first gate. The approval workflow is the second. That covers environment connection setup, CLI OAuth for local development, SFDX project.json plus VS Code extension pack for editor integration, and connected app plus JWT bearer token for non-interactive CI/CD authentication. The full guide with all commands is at realsyllabus.com/Salesforce. Session 82 covers inbound change sets. what they are, how to create them, and the scenarios where change sets still make sense despite the CLI alternative.